Did the historical Jesus perform miracles? Hi, everybody. My name is Robyn Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and part of Paths in Biblical Studies. And I'm actually kind of doing this video on the fly. I just met with one of you one on one on Zoom to talk about some of your questions about early Christianity, and this one came up. And it was a really interesting conversation, and I thought I would bring it all to you. So, did the historical Jesus perform miracles? It kind of depends on what miracles you're talking about and what sources you want to foreground. So, first of all, our earliest evidence, as we've talked about before, for earliest Christianity are Paul's letters. Now, in Paul's letters, he doesn't tend to emphasize the historical Jesus in general. And there are different reasons you can speculate as to why this is the case. Now, one is this is not where Paul is getting his authority as somebody who is part of this burgeoning Jesus movement. Remember, he didn't know the historical Jesus, the man in his lifetime. He knows the resurrected Jesus. This is the figure, the Messiah, who's appearing to him and whom he's talking to. And so that's what he tends to foreground. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't tell us some things about the historical Jesus. And actually, I'm going to be doing a lecture for the next New Insights into the New Testament for the Biblical Studies Academy on what does Paul tell us about the historical Jesus. So stay tuned for more on that. But one thing he does emphasize is that he knows that the historical Jesus, the man who was hanging out with Peter, hanging out with James, was a teacher of the law, essentially. I don't mean that in a strict sense of like this was his job, but he does talk about occasionally some teachings like don't commit adultery, right? So you get that sense that Jesus is reflecting on Jewish law in his teachings. But you don't really get anything about Jesus, say, multiplying loaves and fishes, right? Or I've been talking a lot about Mark 5 over at the BSA. So I don't think Paul tells you the story of the woman with the flow of blood, the hemorrhaging woman, for example, right? And so you would think if he's trying to convey to people that this guy was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah, don't you know he performed this miracle, that miracle, this miracle? He would probably have told you that unless you think he's trading off an authority from a different source and doesn't think that's as important. Now, he does say that Jesus resurrected. That's a pretty good miracle. He defeated death, right? So that for him seems to be extremely consequential. He also talks about doing spiritual or pneumatic demonstrations himself. And I've talked to you about some German scholars like Gustav Volkmar, who postulated in the 19th century that maybe then, when the gospel writers went to write their lives of Jesus, they took some of the pneumatic demonstrations that Paul talks about, things like speaking in tongues, for example. And it does seem like healing is part of this, which wouldn't be surprising for someone anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean being able to claim some authority from some kind of healing power. That wouldn't be at all strange to me. Think Asclepius, right? Who later becomes kind of this pan Mediterranean god. This is attributed to even famous hero figures like Alexander the Great, although through potions. But anyway, this idea that you would be able to heal your friends or heal people, heal the sick. That seems to be a pretty solid narrative that's shared across the ancient Mediterranean. So, no surprise to me that Paul claims it for himself. And some of these German scholars suggested that then sort of the best of miracles were then attributed to Jesus, that he represented the quintessential or ideal position of all of these pneumatic demonstrations that Paul gives us the sketch of. So, if you're looking at Paul, do we know that Jesus performed miracles? Not necessarily. Beyond the resurrection. Again, pretty good miracle. But you don't really have the examples that you get through the Gospels. Now, if you do think of the Gospels as receiving an early Christian account that has been, or an early Jesus movement account that has been passed down from eyewitnesses, if you do believe that, then yeah, you're getting some information about maybe miraculous displays of power, authority that Jesus had during his lifetime. I also find it interesting that the Gospels attribute Jesus's status, at least let's think about Mark, to the idea that when he was baptized, the pneuma came down as a dove and made him God's son. Right? And then this is different, obviously, in Matthew and Luke with the genealogies and the birth narratives. And John has him as the son of God from before time. But this idea that the baptism is something that's key in the Gospels via John the Baptist, and we can talk about John the Baptist's status and role another time. But the idea that baptism is something that Paul also advocates, it's something that gets tied to Jesus through John the Baptist. It's something that's essential to Jesus becoming the Son of God, at least in Mark, but also, an essential purification ritual that takes place within the Gospels. It's something that really has this through line from Paul to the Gospels. And so I have to wonder whether or not we think that Jesus and John the Baptist were actually cousins or that he was Jesus's teacher. Again, let's bracket that for now. Maybe there was some kind of purification ritual like baptism also involved in the activities of the early Jesus movement and around the historical Jesus. So, something to think about. But I think for sure he was a teacher. Um, Beyond that, it's a little bit tough. So, interesting to think through those sources. Again, doesn't mean that he didn't perform miraculous deeds. He didn't have these displays of power, but it really, again, comes down to what do you want to foreground in terms of source material and how much do you want to view the Gospels as eyewitness accounts versus pieces of literature that are going to tap into other kinds of narratives that talk about the status of special individuals and religious experts in antiquity, including their abilities to do things like heal. I mentioned Asclepius before, or perform other kinds of activities around things like demon possession, which oftentimes the line between something like possession and disease processes, that line can be pretty thin. So it's interesting to think about how Jesus reflects those traditions. If you're interested in this question, interested in anything else, want to know more or explore some other issues surrounding the development of the Bible and early Christianity in particular, go over to bartehrman.com/BSA learning. We have, as I mentioned before, I think, again, the number is something like over 170 hours of materials over there, courses that you can take from both myself, from Bart Ehrman, and from other scholars, leading experts in the field. We have all kinds of discussion boards where we iron these things out, and you can ask your own questions. Always interesting to think through these things. It's why I do this, is to uh, field these kinds of questions and really think through it for myself. So, also keep an eye out for the new insights into the New Testament this coming fall. The guest speaker will be, or the primary keynote speaker will be Elaine Pagels. And as I mentioned, I will be doing a lecture around the idea of how Paul reflects on the historical Jesus. So we hope to see you there. Again, that's bartehrman.com/BSA learning.